Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name's Peter Howard at Pahowdy on Twitter. Today we're going to talk about wide receiver breakouts. On a year-to-year basis, pretty much every kind of breakout happens at all positions. I've written a series of articles for DLF looking at when players are most likely to break out and breakout trends, and it's now a process I track for Patreon and I write it up for them. But I was talking about it on Twitter the other day and I thought it might make an interesting smaller video, and yeah, let's talk about it. So 96 wide receivers have broken out for a top 24 season by year 3 in the NFL since 2000. And the majority of those top 24 breakouts actually happened in year 2. The majority of top 12 breakouts happened by year 3. So most wide receivers that break out into the top 24 happen by year 2, but most that break out in year 3 happen in year 3. In fact, there's a pretty substantial difference in that 31% of all breakouts in the top 24 level happen by year 2, and also 32% of top 12 seasons happen in year 3. So if you're looking for ceiling, it's actually worth waiting around an extra year. So the question becomes, for me, who are those wide receivers breaking out in year 3? Interestingly, the majority of wide receivers that broke out into the top 12 in year 3 did not have a top 24 season before they broke out into the top 12. It's a pretty big list because obviously there are quite a few players here that broke out. But of those 51 players, this is a list that broke into a top 12 season in year 3. These are the players who hadn't had a top 24 season beforehand. Now, interestingly, just drawing rough guidelines, the majority of players on this list did not continue to have fantasy relevance or a large amount of fantasy relevance after that year 3 breakout, suggesting that we shouldn't look for productive players or more productive players in year 1 and 2 to find top 12 breakouts. It's interesting that the majority of those players actually didn't continue to have a lot of fantasy relevance after that point. Now, in contrary to that point, you also have Davante Adams, Demaryius Thomas, and there's also someone else, Steve Smith, I think. Yeah, Steve Smith on the bottom of the list. All of those guys obviously continue to have a lot of fantasy relevance. You've also got Eric Decker and Steve Johnson and Chris Godwin, to be fair, who's still pretty, we haven't seen the end of his career, and Cooper Kupp on this list. So I'm not saying that players that didn't have a top 24 season by year 3 are unrelevant or somehow less good players. This doesn't actually say anything individually about those players or those players' performance. We shouldn't be down on players that break out by year 3 to the top 12 without top 24 seasons under their belt. But if you know nothing else about two different players and they both break out in year 3, the player who didn't have more success year 1 and year 2 is probably, majoritively wise, the one who's less likely to have continued fantasy success going forward. Whereas if we look at the list of players who broke out in year 3 at a top 12 level, who did have a top 24 season before that time, the list looks markedly different. Here. Somewhere here. Hopefully there's a fairly shorter list. You'll see there are less players who break out into the top 12 by year 3, even though that's where the majority of top 12 breakouts occur, who had a top 24 season before that. So on this list, we've got the likes of Deontay Johnson very recently, Calvin Ridley, Kenny Golladay, shame, Brandon Cooks, Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, T.Y. Hilton, Des Bryant, Percy Harvin, Greg Jennings, and Chad Johnson. They're not every fantasy relevant receiver ever. Remember, we're just looking at third-year breakouts into the top 12. And there were 96 total that broke out even just into the top 24 by this time. So there are other interesting players. But if we're dividing that group who break out into year 3 into those who had a top 24 season and those who didn't before that time, this list, the majority of players continue to have top 12 and top 24 fantasy relevant seasons at a much higher rate. Looking for players who might break out next year, it's pretty much impossible to make a list of all players who've never had a top 24 season before and then highlight them as potential breakouts, because that's the majority of wide receivers. But we can track players who've had top 24 breakouts and say that in their third year, this is their most likely top 12 breakout year, and those who break out with a previous record of being inside the top 24 at least, the majority of that group continue to go on to have fantasy relevant seasons. That makes it a fairly interesting group to go looking for, and we only lose a minority of that group like Davante Adams, Demaryius Thomas, and Steve Smith. We only lose 3, and everyone else, or the majority of everyone else who broke out in year 3 into the top 12, continue to have fantasy success, and so it's a fairly interesting group to go looking for and fairly easy to filter for it. And the reason I like it is year over year, it actually produced a relatively short list. So what you see about here is players who fit that criteria. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, CeeDee Lamb, Chase Claypool, Darnell Mooney, Michael Pittman, and T. Higgins have all had top 24 seasons, and they're entering their third year in 2022. Now, obviously, Jalen Waddle and Amon-Ra St. Brown are entering their second year, and so they're not fitting the perfect group that I was talking about throughout the majority of this video. And so CeeDee Lamb, Chase Claypool, Darnell Mooney, Michael Pittman, and T. Higgins actually fit all those criteria. Like I said, I've been tracking this list. This will be my second season writing it up, and we look at top 5, top 12, top 24, and even top 36 a little bit for those articles. But this isn't just by means of plugging my Patreon, as I said on Twitter. It's more to show you the basis of a rough way that you can just go looking for players without having to rely on your eye or your understanding of statistics or your ability to track the minute changes in the NFL landscape. This is just the majority of where players have come from, and there is some similarity to what they have done previously and what they are going to do after that point, or after the 2022 season in this case. It's a way of making the fewest assumptions and creating a relatively short list of players who might break out. Now, after you get the list, the idea is to interpret it, right? Because not all of those players are going to break into the top 12. Otherwise, everyone would continue to have fantasy success and be on that short list we just looked at with the Mike Evans and Brandon Cooks of the world and the DeAndre Hopkins of the world. Because not all top 12 breakouts happen in year 3, and so I actually cast a wider net of likelihood of breaking out at any particular career year. There are players who break out after year 3. I run it through a few extra filters, and I'm going to show you where that top 12 breakout list is right now that I'm working on for the Patreon. Now, the percentage rate that you see next to that is actually the hit rate group of career year. So 22% of players hit a top 12 season by year 2 if they are going to do it. CeeDee Lamb's entering that most likely year, the most common year that players break out. That's 32% of all top 12 breakouts happen in year 3, as we've been talking about throughout the majority. But Mike Williams is in a very low percentage rate in terms of where top 12 breakouts happen, but they do happen going into career year 6. Does that mean these are the players I think are going to break out to the top 12? No. These are the players that I think are most interesting to interpret and see who I might think is more likely to break into that top 12 next year, and that's what I do in the Patreon article. Mostly I want to just offer an insight into how I go looking for it without having to rely on my in-depth, personal, unique ability to interpret the data of that. I don't know that stuff. But I do know how to go looking for what's happened most often and look for commonalities while making as few assumptions as possible, and then go looking for what that might mean for the future of players in the NFL the following season. And that's my process. Hope you found it interesting. You can find my college database as well as a basic NFL database, at least, that you can filter for some of this stuff. Pinned to my Twitter timeline, pinned to my Patreon timeline, or just at me sometime, and I'm happy to talk about it. I did put a thread out on this on Twitter, so I guess I'll leave that in the comments section below as well if you want to go check out that and look at the images I put up on the screen a little more in depth. Let me know if you enjoy a smaller video, or even smaller, or maybe start making videos. I don't know. Really appreciate you checking out if you did, and I will talk to you in the next one. Take down the film watchers and nerds all at once. I am one of those skeptical of status quo, lazy and to the bone, no doubt about it.